Hello viewers, welcome to Istanbul. This is Atilla Yeşilara, the front person for Real Turkey channel. It's Monday and obviously we need to talk about CHP's astounding, unexpected victory in Turkey's municipal elections. CHP, of course, is the main opposition party. If you check my archive, in fact, the last video I shot, you would see that I predicted CHP would win the big prizes, the grand prizes, which are Turkey's biggest three metropolises, Izmir, Ankara, and Istanbul. That wasn't unexpected, but CHP also won many more cities and city centers, increased its share in provincial assemblies, increased its share of national votes, so much so that first time since 1977, CHP became the number one party in Turkey. AKP closed the elections 2 points behind CHP. So this video is focused on three related subjects. A, obviously a brief summary of election results. 2, the reasons for AKP's defeat. And 3, what happens going forward with particular emphasis on economic policy. Okay, elections. I'm sure if you follow Turkey, most of the commentary you have read or watched about elections has focused on Istanbul, which obviously is the biggest city. Moreover, its current mayor, Mr. Ekrem İmamoğlu, is widely considered the only viable alternative to Mr. Erdogan in 2028 presidential elections. Now, there, Ekrem İmamoğlu won. His partner, Ankara Mayor Mansur Yavaş, also from CHP, also won. And in Izmir, not an incumbent, but a new candidate for CHP, also swept the AKP candidate. Results in Izmir are not in themselves surprising. Izmir is a highly secular and modern city, and it emphasizes this ideology. It strongly clings to its secular and liberal lifestyle and usually votes along those lines. So AKP was never favored to win that city as well. In Ankara and Istanbul, two things are very striking. A, the margin of victory for Mansur Yavaş, which is 30 percentage points. In Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu defeated Murat Kurum by 11 percentage points. Secondly, in the last municipal elections in 2019, when CHP won, it lost the majority in city assemblies, which meant that Mansur Yavaş and Ekrem İmamoğlu's acts and legislation were prevented by the AKP-MHP opposition. This time, they will have a much clearer mandate and much easier time pushing the legislation. Of course, Erdogan may still veto those, but that needs to be seen. 3, in 2019, CHP won in an alliance that consisted of 4 parties, the center-right İYİP, and 2 smaller parties, Islamist Saadet, and also conservative Democratic Party. This time, all of these parties ran their candidates against CHP. And Ekrem İmamoğlu and Mansur Yavaş just defeated them bitterly. İYİP, essentially, in Ankara, Izmir, and Istanbul, disappeared from the polls. But even more striking, and if we can have a map here of Turkey, is the advances made by CHP in what were considered indefeatable bastions of AKP. These were largely in the western interior parts of Anatolia. 3 examples come to mind: Bursa, Balıkesir, and Manisa. 3 large population and partly or mostly industrialized cities, which have for last 30 years or so always voted in an AKP mayor. They were all lost. Across the country, I think CHP added 14 major cities or urban centers to its roster. AKP lost a similar amount. Another surprise in the election was the ultra-Islamist and AKP's new rival, New Welfare Party, which managed to win 2 cities, the large population and multi-ethnic southern hub of Şanlıurfa and small, modest interior Anatolia town of Yozgat. Nevertheless, New Welfare, which scored around 3% in national elections, raising its national vote to over 6% and winning 2 major municipalities, is a major surprise. In addition to making advances into AKP's strongholds across Anatolia, CHP also won several boroughs in every city, which had heretofore never voted for CHP before. At the end, my friend here, Semih, who is co-producing this video, has just reminded me that in 2014, less than 20% of the population were governed by CHP mayors. Today, it's 84%. So this is really just unusual in the sense that you have a central government, which is run by Erdogan and AKP, MHP, and local governments that have been completely disassociated from the central government. Of course, that's going to create problems. Why did Erdogan lose? As I've said, in Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir, polls pretty much and accurately predicted that AKP would lose because Erdogan's selection of candidates were really poor. I mean, Erdogan was really hubristic. He thought the opposition was in such a disarray that, using a Turkish political term, even if he nominated his jacket, it would win. I suppose a Roman Empire once said, even my donkey would win. Obviously, AKP candidates are not donkeys. They are more like mules. But this time he really went with very poor candidates. In Ankara, Turgut Altınok was marred by unethical enrichment scandals. In Istanbul, former urban planning minister Murat Kurum was just not a politician. The guy is a good guy. He's kind of goofy but good, but he's a technocrat. He doesn't understand politics, and he committed one gaffe after another and accelerated AKP's downfall in the city. But above and beyond, we need to question why CHP won in such a resounding manner that no one foresaw, I believe even CHP. The answers are economic. Since polls closed, I've been surfing YouTube and mainstream media channels on my digital service provider. Largely, I watch pro-AKP channels to see what they think, and there is a consensus: economics. Going into last May elections, the Turkish economy was also very poor, but Mr. Erdogan spent more than 4% of GDP on pork barreling. And by then, just luck would have it, the amount of money he poured into the economy overcame gradually rising inflation. In the passing 9 months in the interim, no matter how much he spent, discretionary incomes could not keep up with soaring inflation. I mean, essentially, just like Turkish Central Bank, he followed inflation, and it came to the point where he realized spending more would bring a fiscal disaster, perhaps even, a default by Turkish Treasury or widely monetization of debt, that he stopped. And when he stopped, in particular in terms of the retirees, the most loyal constituents of AKP, he condemned them to poverty, and they punished AKP, by voting for, I presume, ultra-Islamist New Welfare, and two, and as importantly, by simply staying away from the polls. Two, I believe, it was Erdogan's crony regime. Now, cronyism happens in every country, but in Turkey it's endemic. And cronyism, Turks have this interesting philosophy. I think it has almost become a proverb or a meme that as long as they give me what I need, I don't care if they steal. Which simply means as long as Mr. Erdogan manages to grow the pie, people don't mind getting smaller slices because that smaller slice is bigger than the slice they got the year before. Now, this hasn't been the case in Turkey since the pandemic, but people in the cities watched very closely in their daily lives how AKP mayors, assemblymen, elderwomen construction companies, other business interests, Islamic sects that are close to AKP, Erdogan or the local AKP officials enrich themselves. So it became very blatant and blaring that Erdogan was stealing and that his regime was based on cronyism. And I think that has been punished in cities where, as I've said, like Kastamonu and Kilis and Adıyaman, where CHP barely got any votes in the past. And the final reason is politics. I think the Turkey's devoutly Islamic community, which is probably 20-25% of the total vote. Conservatives are much larger. They're probably 40-45%. But the true Islamists realize that Erdogan's advocacy of Islam is not genuine. It's basically geared to his political objectives. And New Welfare cleverly exploited that gap between what Erdogan professes to believe, which is political Islam, and what his actions suggest. For instance, New Welfare really hit AKP hard by asking why Turkey doesn't impose a trade embargo in Israel and why Israeli tourists are still allowed to visit Turkey. Again, maybe rational, maybe not, but Erdogan couldn't really withstand these accusations. Moreover, I think a lot of Islamists didn't forgive that a few years ago, Erdogan was the biggest enemy of Mohammed bin Salman, who was audacious enough to order the murder of a journalist in his country's Istanbul consulate, and Erdogan decided to forgive him. Or why he shook hands with Egyptian strongman Mr. Abdel Fattah Sisi, whom he berated and demonized for toppling the Muslim Brotherhood regime. Erdogan essentially collapsed under his own dichotomies or controversies. Where do we go from here? Again, check my past videos. Since the beginning of the year, a lot of my videos have been dedicated to elections, democracy, and economic policy in relation to that. It is true in all countries, but in Turkey more so than others, politics and economic policy cannot be separated from each other. So to understand where Turkish economy is heading, we need to look at what Erdogan's political objectives are. Where clearly, this is his last term. He needs to change the constitution to grant himself a new term, or the Grand Assembly, Turkey's parliament, needs to call early elections, in which case the term limits don't apply. And this indeed remains his objective, and before the elections, counting on a victory, Erdogan already set in motion plans to write a new constitution and was sending feelers out to opposition parties whether they would be interested in early elections. Now, these plans probably have been shelved simply because if you look at the votes, the national vote, measured in different ways, I'm not going to bother you with technicalities. You can measure it by the share of by the distribution of municipal votes or the assembly votes. But no matter how you slice the pie, it shows that AKP, its main inseparable ally, MHP, are at 40%, 41% at best. New Welfare probably is not going to cooperate with AKP this time because its leader Fatih Erbakan senses that in the post-Erdogan era, he is the most viable and likely candidate to become the new leader of Turkish Islamists. But even if we add AKP, MHP, and New Welfare, the total share of the national vote is 47%. Now, remembering that a defeat in early elections or a constitutional exercise, constitutional referendum, would essentially spell the end of Mr. Erdogan's career, it's simply not logical that he would try to do so. What would he do instead? Mr. Erdogan is known for his balcony speeches. I suppose these are acceptance speeches in American lingo, where this time he was much more modest, humble, but he specifically mentioned his faith in the economic stabilization program. In Turkey, this is expressed as we shall more strongly adhere to the targets enunciated in the medium-term economic program. I'm saving you the political lingo and the finesse to explain you what he meant. But after such a defeat, which I'm sure a lot of his consultants and strategists would blame on economy czar Mehmet Şimşek's belt-tightening policies, it is meaningful for him to say that he has faith and that he's going to stay the course on the economic austerity program. And in fact, on Monday, Mehmet Şimşek, the coordinator of this economic program, shared in his Twitter X account that austerity program would now be pursued with more diligence. In fact, he also outlined what will be done next, which is tight monetary policy, which I read even more interest rate hikes by central bank. He mentioned incomes policy, which means the disastrous habit of indexing biannual or annual salary and pension hikes to past inflation will be amended somehow. Perhaps forecast inflation will be used. And 3, that there will be budget cuts. He didn't go into the detail of how the budget can be cut. I am not so sure whether he meant substantial cuts in discretionary spending and state infrastructure spending or just, savings measures. But he did mention that. And I think this is the path Turkey is going to go. Mr. Şimşek and his colleague at central bank, Mr. Fatih Karahan, will raise interest rates further. They will strictly control the currency in a crawling peg manner, which means dollar TL is going to appreciate less than forecast inflation. And certainly, at least initiate symbolic budget cuts. More importantly, the next periodic salary review is in June, with new salaries to be announced in July. I don't think Turkey's blue-collar workers who work at the minimum wage, the civil servants or pensioners will get more than just a cost of living adjustment. No more generous hikes. All of which means that Turkey is going to face a recession or an economic stagnation very similar to economic recession. But I think also the fruits will be reaped fairly quickly with help from seasonal factors as well as tourism and a bountiful agricultural season, I hope. Turkey should start experiencing disinflation. Now remember, as far as voting preferences and political choices go, annualized inflation doesn't mean anything to me or to the woman on the street. We look at the monthly pace of inflation. If, as predicted, and I find these predictions reasonable, as predicted by Central Bank of Turkey, monthly inflation begins to decline from the current pace of 6%, first to 2%, at the end of the summer to 3% or lower, and towards the end of the year 2%, I think inflation expectations will be broken. I think dollarization will reverse, which means more Turkish lira deposits, less demand for foreign currency. Obviously, a cooler economy, slower domestic demand translates into a smaller current account deficit. And finally, I'm sure a lot of foreign investors and businesses are still very skeptical about Mr. Erdogan's post-election intentions. They will monitor Turkey for another 15 days or a month. But if there are any kind of signals or specific acts that bolster the view that Mehmet Şimşek is staying in his post and he's given more of a leeway to pursue a stricter belt-tightening program, I think Turkey will receive substantial flows of foreign financial and some foreign direct investment, which would also strengthen the currency, reduce bond yields, and ease the pain of the economic stagnation that I have just mentioned. At the end, look, if Erdogan won, Turkey in name would remain a democracy, but essentially would become an authoritarian regime where Mr. Erdogan would have been guaranteed presidency for life. Now it has become competitive again. I'm not saying Erdogan would lose, but once again, democracy survived. Citizens of Turkey, Kurds, Turks, Arabs, Jews, Armenians, whatever, have proved that they're not going to put up with authoritarianism. And this gives me hope, because at the end, economic development for a country like Turkey at this stage of GDP per capita is driven by more democracy and more democratic institutions than vice versa. So at the end, it's a hopeful day for Turkey. I want to thank you for watching. It's very interesting. Last week, I met two members of my audience, all non-residents. For some reason, they were in a conference. I was the speaker, and they came and shook my hands. I have a very tiny audience, but it's great to be heard. And I hope you like this video. Share, subscribe, and send your comments, which I find very enlightening and entertaining. This is Atilla Yeşilara saying goodbye from Istanbul.